When did humans first start smoking weed? Imagine, for a moment, a world before cigarettes, before rolling papers, before modern dispensaries, and even before anyone had a word that sounded quite like the modern idea of smoking weed. Cannabis was already there. It grew wild in parts of Eurasia. Its tough fibers could become rope and cloth. Its seeds could be eaten. Its oil could be used for practical purposes. And over thousands of years, people gradually discovered that the plant had another property that would eventually become one of the most culturally important things about it. It could alter the mind. But that raises a surprisingly difficult question. When did people first discover this? When did someone, somewhere in the ancient world, look at a cannabis plant and realize that burning it and breathing in the smoke could produce an unusual sensation? We cannot point to one person. There was no first known cannabis smoker whose name was recorded in history. No ancient diary says, "Today I discovered marijuana." Instead, the story unfolds slowly, across thousands of years, through archaeology, ancient texts, chemistry, anthropology, and the remains of plants found in places where they were clearly being used. And the deeper we go, the stranger the story becomes. Because cannabis was not originally a plant associated with one single purpose. For much of human history, it was a useful plant first. Its fibers were valuable, its seeds were nutritious, its oil was useful, and its ability to affect the mind was only one part of its long relationship with humanity. The earliest chapters of this story begin far away from the modern image of someone sitting quietly with a joint. They begin among ancient communities living across Central Asia. Thousands of years ago, humans were moving through enormous landscapes of grassland, mountain valleys, forests, and river systems. These communities cultivated plants, domesticated animals, traded with distant neighbors, and gradually learned which plants could provide food, medicine, fibers, dyes, oils, or unusual sensations. Cannabis was one of those plants. The plant itself is ancient, but the history of deliberate human use is much more complicated. Cannabis appears to have originated somewhere in Central Asia and surrounding regions, although scientists continue to debate the exact geographic details of its earliest evolution. What is much clearer is that humans began interacting with cannabis very early. The plant was extraordinarily useful. Its stalks contained strong fibers. Those fibers could be processed into cordage, textiles, nets, and other materials. Its seeds contain oil and nutrients. That practical usefulness probably helped cannabis spread far beyond its original range. People carried plants. They carried seeds. They traded materials. They moved along rivers and across steppe routes. And wherever humans went, useful plants often followed. For thousands of years, cannabis could have traveled with people without anyone necessarily smoking it. This distinction matters. Finding cannabis remains in an ancient settlement does not automatically mean the inhabitants were getting high. Finding cannabis fibers does not prove recreational use. Finding seeds does not prove ritual smoking. Archaeologists, therefore, have to be extremely careful. The evidence for ancient cannabis intoxication has to come from clues that are much harder to explain in purely practical terms. Burned plant material is one such clue. Chemical residues are another. Ancient written descriptions can help too. And occasionally, archaeology gives us something extraordinary. Evidence suggesting that people deliberately gathered cannabis, heated it, and inhaled its smoke. One of the most important regions in this story is Central Asia. The great grasslands of Eurasia were not empty spaces. They were corridors. People moved through them for generations, carrying technologies, animals, languages, beliefs, and plants. Among these communities were groups often associated with the broader Scythian world. The ancient Greeks wrote about these nomadic peoples, sometimes describing them as mysterious, dangerous, or exotic. One Greek historian, Herodotus, wrote about a ritual involving a plant that many scholars have identified as cannabis. He described people placing plant material on heated stones inside an enclosed structure, and then inhaling the resulting vapor and smoke. Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE. By his time, cannabis inhalation was clearly not a brand new experiment. It was already part of a cultural practice. The important question, therefore, is not whether people smoked cannabis in the 5th century BCE. They did. The real question is how much earlier the practice began. And this is where archaeology becomes especially fascinating. In recent decades, researchers have found evidence of cannabis being burned in ancient Central Asian contexts. Some of the strongest evidence comes from archaeological sites in regions associated with ancient nomadic communities. At one site in the Pamir Mountains, researchers discovered wooden vessels containing cannabis residue, along with evidence suggesting that the plant had been heated. The site dates to roughly the 1st millennium. BCE chemical analysis found cannabinoids in the material. That is significant because it gives us more than a vague historical story. It provides physical evidence. People were not merely growing cannabis. They were apparently selecting and using it in a way that could release its psychoactive compounds. And this tells us something important about the development of human relationships with plants. People did not need modern chemistry to understand that certain plants produced certain effects. They learned through observation. They learned through experimentation. They learned through tradition. Someone might notice that eating a particular seed caused one sensation while burning another part of the plant produced something entirely different. Someone else might discover that particular varieties were stronger. A community could develop rituals around the experience. Eventually, knowledge could become tradition, and tradition could travel. This is probably one of the most important ideas for understanding the ancient history of cannabis. There was almost certainly no single moment when humanity invented weed smoking. Instead, there was a gradual process of discovery. People encountered the plant. They experimented with it. They discovered its practical properties. They discovered its medicinal possibilities. They discovered its psychoactive properties. And different societies developed different ways of using it. Some may have eaten it. Some may have prepared it into drinks or mixtures. Some may have burned it. Some may have used it in ceremonies. Some may have used it medicinally. And some may simply have cultivated it because it was useful. The modern idea of cannabis as a single category hides this enormous diversity. To understand the ancient world, it helps to forget the modern image for a moment. There were no standardized strains in the modern commercial sense. There were no carefully measured doses. There were no laboratory-tested products. There was no modern understanding of THC. There was simply a plant with different properties, and humans learning how to interact with it. The story becomes even more interesting when we look at ancient burial sites. Burial practices can preserve things that ordinary settlements do not. When people are buried with objects, those objects can tell us something about their identity, status, beliefs, or daily life. In some ancient Eurasian burials, archaeologists have found containers associated with burning substances. Some contained cannabis remains. Others contained residues that suggest mixtures of aromatic or psychoactive plants. This raises the possibility that cannabis smoke was not simply recreational. It could have been part of ritual behavior. And this makes sense when we think about ancient societies. The boundary between medicine, religion, ritual, and recreation was often much less clearly defined than it is today. A plant could be medicine and sacred substance at the same time. A substance could be used to alter consciousness and also be considered useful for healing. A ceremony could involve fragrance, smoke, music, chanting, fasting, and plants. The experience itself could have been interpreted as communication with ancestors, spirits, gods, or another realm. We should be careful not to impose modern categories onto ancient people. When an ancient community inhaled cannabis smoke, we cannot automatically call it recreational marijuana use. Their purpose may have been entirely different. Perhaps they were participating in a funeral ritual. Perhaps they were seeking a religious experience. Perhaps they were treating an illness. Perhaps they were simply enjoying an unusual sensation. Or perhaps all of these possibilities existed in different places. That uncertainty is part of what makes the history fascinating. The ancient world was not one culture. It was thousands of cultures, connected in complicated ways. Cannabis traveled through these networks, and as it traveled, its uses changed. One of the most important regions in this story is ancient China. Cannabis has an extremely long history there. Archaeological evidence indicates that people in China were using cannabis for practical purposes thousands of years ago. The plant was important for fiber. Its seeds were used as food. Cannabis textiles became part of the technological development of ancient societies. But China also has a long history of medicinal cannabis use. Ancient Chinese medical traditions included cannabis among various plants used for different conditions. The legendary figure Shennong, associated with early Chinese herbal knowledge, is sometimes connected with cannabis in later traditions. However, separating historical evidence from legendary tradition is important. Ancient medical texts were often compiled over long periods. Stories about legendary physicians may preserve fragments of old knowledge, but they should not be treated as direct eyewitness records. What we can say with greater confidence is that cannabis had a recognized place in ancient Chinese material and medicinal culture. But was ancient China where people first smoked cannabis? The evidence is much less clear. The earliest Chinese evidence strongly supports cultivation and practical use. Smoking specifically requires stronger evidence. This distinction again becomes essential. A plant can be burned for many reasons. Smoke can be produced accidentally. Plants can be burned as fuel. Aromatic substances can be burned for fragrance. Medicinal plants can be burned to create fumes, and not every ancient smoke-producing ritual involved inhalation. So archaeologists search for patterns. Was there a specialized vessel? Was the plant material deliberately placed inside it? Was there evidence of heating? Were cannabinoids preserved? Was the vessel positioned in a way consistent with inhalation? Were similar objects found at multiple sites? Each clue adds another piece to the puzzle. And when several clues appear together, the argument becomes much stronger. This is how ancient history is often reconstructed, not from one perfect document, but from fragments, a burned seed, a residue, a vessel, a burial, a written description, a chemical signature, a repeated pattern. And sometimes, thousands of years later, these fragments begin to form a recognizable story. The story of cannabis smoking appears to become clearer in Central Asia during the first millennium BCE. By the time Greek writers encountered Scythian customs, inhaling cannabis smoke was already established enough to be described as a recognizable practice. Herodotus's description is particularly valuable because it gives us a rare written account from the ancient Mediterranean world. He described the Scythians using a small, tent-like structure. They placed heated stones inside. Then they added a plant that produced smoke and an intense effect. According to Herodotus, the participants enjoyed the experience. Whether every detail of his account is accurate is another matter. Herodotus was famous for collecting stories from many places. Some of his descriptions are remarkably accurate. Others contain exaggerations or information that modern historians question. Still, his account is consistent with archaeological evidence showing that cannabis was indeed used by some Central Asian communities. So by the 5th century BCE, cannabis smoking was definitely part of human culture. But the plant's journey did not stop there. It moved west. It moved east. It traveled through trade networks. It entered different medical traditions. It appeared in different forms. And eventually, it reached regions where people developed their own relationships with it. The history of cannabis in the ancient world is therefore also a history of human movement. Think about the enormous distances involved. A plant that originated in Central Asia could eventually appear in regions thousands of kilometers away. But people were moving constantly. Nomadic groups crossed grasslands. Merchants followed caravan routes. Armies crossed mountains. Farmers migrated. Empires expanded. Religious traditions spread. And plants traveled with all of them. Cannabis was particularly well suited to human transportation because people could carry its seeds. Once introduced to a new environment, the plant could be cultivated if conditions allowed, and knowledge about its use could travel alongside it. Perhaps someone taught a neighboring community how to weave its fibers. Another person learned how to prepare its seeds. A healer discovered its medicinal qualities. A ritual specialist learned how to use its smoke. A merchant carried seeds to another settlement. Over generations, these small exchanges could transform the geographic range of the plant. By the ancient and medieval periods, cannabis was known across much of Eurasia, but its story was never uniform. In some regions, fiber was the primary attraction. In others, medicinal applications were more important. In still others, psychoactive use became significant. This is why saying people started smoking weed in year X oversimplifies the evidence. The practice probably developed gradually and independently in different places, and the plant itself existed long before smoking became widespread. There is another important question. Why would humans smoke cannabis at all? After all, cannabis can be used in many other ways. Why inhale the smoke? The answer may partly lie in the chemistry of the plant. When cannabis is heated, certain cannabinoids become more readily available for inhalation. People did not know the chemistry, but they could observe the effects. And once a community discovered that burning the plant produced a different experience than eating or handling it, the method could become traditional. Fire was already one of humanity's oldest technologies. People knew how to heat stones. They knew how to create smoke. They knew how to burn aromatic plants. They knew how to build enclosed spaces. They understood through experience that smoke could be inhaled. Cannabis simply became one more plant that could be incorporated into this ancient relationship between fire, smoke, and human consciousness. And this brings us to an important point. Smoking itself is much older than tobacco. Modern people often associate smoking with tobacco because tobacco became globally widespread after the European contact with the Americas. But humans were inhaling smoke from plants long before tobacco reached Europe. The plants varied. The purposes varied. The methods varied. People burned herbs for fragrance. They inhaled medicinal fumes. They used smoke in ceremonies. They experimented with plants that changed perception. Cannabis was one part of this much larger human history of smoke, and yet cannabis developed a particularly interesting reputation because its effects could be strong enough to become culturally meaningful. The experience could alter perception. It could change mood. It could affect time perception. It could produce relaxation or unusual thoughts. And for ancient people trying to understand the mysteries of consciousness, such experiences could have profound meaning. Imagine living thousands of years ago without modern neuroscience. You do not know what neurotransmitters are. You do not know what receptors are. You do not know why one plant changes your perception. You simply know that after inhaling a certain smoke, the world feels different. Perhaps colors seem unusual. Perhaps sounds feel more intense. Perhaps ordinary thoughts become strangely interesting. Perhaps you feel sleepy. Perhaps you feel anxious. Perhaps you feel detached from ordinary concerns. The explanation would naturally be cultural. Maybe the plant contains a spirit. Maybe the smoke carries prayers. Maybe the gods are communicating. Maybe the experience is medicinal. Maybe the plant is sacred. The interpretation depends on the society. And this is exactly what we see across history. The same plant can have completely different meanings in different cultures. One community may regard it as sacred. Another may consider it medicine. Another may regard it as an ordinary crop. Another may barely care about its psychoactive effects at all. This diversity continued for centuries. In the Middle East and parts of Asia, cannabis eventually became associated with forms of hashish. Hashish is different from simply smoking dried cannabis flowers. It involves concentrated resin from the plant. The history of hashish is complicated, and its widespread cultural prominence developed much later than the earliest evidence for cannabis use. By the medieval period, however, cannabis preparations were known in parts of the Islamic world. Some medical writers discussed cannabis. Some communities used psychoactive preparations, and stories began circulating about groups and individuals associated with hashish. But many popular stories about medieval cannabis have been exaggerated. The famous connection between hashish and the medieval assassins, for example, is far more complicated than the popular legend suggests. The word assassin is sometimes popularly claimed to come directly from hashish, but historians generally treat that simplistic explanation with caution. The medieval history of cannabis deserves its own careful treatment, because written sources often mix observation, rumor, political propaganda, and stereotypes. The same problem appears throughout cannabis history. Whenever a society encountered an unfamiliar psychoactive practice, outsiders often described it in dramatic terms. This means historical researchers have to separate what people believed from what actually happened. And that distinction is particularly important when discussing ancient drugs. Ancient writers were not neutral scientists. They were human beings. They had cultural assumptions. They had political interests. They sometimes misunderstood foreign customs. They sometimes repeated stories. They sometimes deliberately exaggerated. So when Herodotus describes Scythian cannabis use, his account is valuable, but it should be read alongside archaeology rather than treated as unquestionable fact. The archaeological evidence helps confirm that cannabis inhalation was real, and it may push the timeline further back. Some researchers have suggested that humans may have been using cannabis for its psychoactive effects more than 2,000 years before the Common Era. But the evidence is debated. There are hints. There are botanical remains. There are residues. There are unusual burning installations. But a hint is not the same thing as proof. This is one of the great challenges in ancient drug history. Organic substances often disappear. Wood rots, leaves decay. Smoke leaves little physical evidence. Cannabinoid molecules can degrade. And ancient people rarely wrote detailed descriptions of everyday plant use. So the archaeological record is naturally incomplete. We should therefore resist the temptation to invent a precise date. The most responsible conclusion is that cannabis was used by humans for thousands of years, and evidence for deliberate psychoactive use and inhalation becomes increasingly convincing by the first millennium BCE. But the roots may reach much further back, perhaps much further. The story becomes especially intriguing when we consider the relationship between cannabis and migration. Ancient Central Asian peoples did not live in isolation. The Eurasian steppe connected regions that modern maps divide into separate countries. People could travel enormous distances. Goods moved along routes that existed long before the formal Silk Road. The exchange was not always peaceful. Sometimes plants traveled with merchants. Sometimes they traveled with armies. Sometimes seeds were carried intentionally. Sometimes they were accidental companions. Over centuries, cannabis spread into Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and eventually Africa. India became especially important in the cultural history of cannabis. Cannabis had a long history there, including medicinal, ritual, and culinary preparations. One famous preparation became known as bhang. Bhang is traditionally made using cannabis leaves and other ingredients, and has a long cultural history in parts of South Asia. But again, this is not identical to modern cannabis smoking. The plant could be consumed in drinks or foods. Different parts of the plant were used differently. Different preparations produced different effects, and different traditions assigned different meanings to those preparations. In some Hindu traditions, cannabis became associated with the god Shiva. The historical development of these associations is complex, and later traditions should not automatically be projected backward thousands of years. But it is clear that cannabis eventually became embedded in religious and cultural practices in South Asia. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the plant's history. A species that began as a useful crop could become woven into religion, medicine, commerce, agriculture, and social life. And that transformation happened gradually. There was no single inventor, no single civilization discovered cannabis. Humanity discovered different parts of it at different times. First, perhaps its usefulness as a fiber, then its value as food, then medicinal possibilities, then psychoactive properties, then specialized methods of preparation, and eventually, in some cultures, smoking became one of the preferred methods. But the history of smoking cannabis also depends on technology. You need something to burn the plant in. You need some way to direct smoke. Early users may have simply inhaled smoke from burning material. Later, people developed specialized vessels. Pipes appeared in different cultures. Some were made from wood, others from stone, others from clay. Some were simple, others were elaborate. In Central Asia, archaeological evidence includes vessels that may have been designed for inhaling smoke from heated plant material. This technology did not need to resemble a modern pipe. Ancient people were inventive. A container with a small opening could function in ways that seem unfamiliar today. A cloth or leather structure could contain smoke. Heated stones could release vapor. A hollow tube could direct fumes. Human experimentation is remarkably adaptable. And once a method worked, it could become part of tradition. The role of fire is particularly important. In many ancient societies, fire was not merely a source of warmth. It was a technological tool. It transformed food. It hardened materials. It created light. It enabled metalworking. It produced smoke. It marked ritual spaces. It separated ordinary life from sacred activity. So using fire to transform a plant would have been entirely natural. The question was simply what happened when that transformed plant entered the human body. Cannabis offered a particularly unusual result, and people noticed. The ancient history of cannabis also reminds us that human beings have always experimented with their environment. We sometimes imagine ancient people as passive recipients of nature, but they were not. They were observers. They tested plants. They learned which berries were edible, which roots were poisonous, which leaves soothed pain, which seeds provided energy, which mushrooms altered consciousness, which plants made good fibers, which resins smelled pleasant when burned. This knowledge was accumulated over generations. It was transmitted orally. Some of it was forgotten. Some became ritual. Some became medicine. Some became agriculture. And some became stories. Cannabis survived all of these transformations. By the medieval period, cannabis was deeply integrated into many societies. In Europe, hemp became particularly important as a fiber crop. Hemp ropes and textiles were valuable for ships, clothing, and practical goods. Cannabis cultivation, therefore, did not necessarily mean psychoactive use. A medieval farmer growing hemp might have cared primarily about rope. A sailor might have cared about durable cordage. A textile worker might have cared about fibers. A merchant might have cared about oil or seed. The plant had a broad economic life independent of intoxication. This is important because modern discussions sometimes make the mistake of imagining that cannabis was always cultivated primarily for its psychoactive properties. Historically, that was not true. For much of Eurasian history, cannabis was a multi-purpose crop. Its psychoactive effects were only one part of its usefulness. And in some societies, those effects may have been considered unimportant. The global history of cannabis changed dramatically after the expansion of European exploration and colonial trade, but that belongs to a later chapter. Before reaching the modern era, we need to understand the ancient foundations. Because by the time Europeans began describing cannabis in different parts of the world, humans had already been living with the plant for thousands of years. Its history was already ancient. Its cultivation was already widespread. Its medicinal traditions were already developed. Its ritual associations were already established. And people had already learned how to inhale its smoke. The modern world did not invent cannabis use. It inherited it. And then it transformed it. That transformation would eventually lead to prohibition, medical research, global political controversy, and the modern cannabis industry. But before all of that, there was simply a plant. A plant growing quietly in the landscapes of Eurasia. A plant that humans first valued for its practical usefulness. A plant that traveled with them. A plant that entered their medicine. A plant that entered their rituals. And, somewhere along the long road of human experimentation, a plant whose smoke changed the way people experienced the world. The precise first moment is lost. Perhaps it happened beside a fire. Perhaps someone tossed cannabis into the flames and noticed that the smoke felt different. Perhaps someone deliberately placed the plant over heated stones. Perhaps the discovery happened during a ritual. Perhaps it happened accidentally. Perhaps different communities discovered the same thing independently. We simply do not know. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Ancient history is often about learning to live with incomplete evidence. We can reconstruct patterns. We can compare archaeological sites. We can analyze chemical residues. We can read ancient writers. We can study botanical genetics. We can trace migration routes. But we cannot travel backward in time. We cannot ask the first cannabis smoker what they were thinking. We cannot know what they felt. We cannot know whether they understood what they had discovered. All we can do is follow the evidence. And the evidence leads us back thousands of years. It leads us towards Central Asia, toward ancient communities who lived long before the modern nations we recognize, toward people who traveled on horseback and foot across vast landscapes, toward burial grounds and settlements, toward fire pits and vessels, toward the earliest traces of a relationship between humans and cannabis that would eventually spread across the world. So, when did people start smoking weed? The safest answer is that cannabis has been used by humans for thousands of years, while convincing archaeological and written evidence for deliberate psychoactive cannabis inhalation appears by at least the first millennium BCE, particularly in Central Asian contexts. But the practice may be older, much older. The earliest experiment is hidden from us. The first person who discovered the intoxicating smoke left no name, no monument, no autobiography, no exact date, only a trail made of ancient plants, burned residues, vessels, burial objects, and stories passed down through generations. And that trail takes us into a world where the boundaries between medicine, ritual, agriculture, and altered consciousness were far less rigid than they are today. As the centuries passed, cannabis continued to travel. It crossed mountains. It followed trade routes. It entered new climates. It became part of new languages. And wherever it arrived, people made their own choices about what the plant meant. For some, it was rope. For others, food. For others, medicine. For others, ritual. And for some, smoke. The history of cannabis therefore begins not with a drug, but with a plant. And perhaps that is the most useful way to understand the entire story. Before cannabis became controversial, commercial, medicinal, religious, illegal, legal, recreational, or political, it was simply one of the many plants humans learned to know. And humans have always been curious about plants. That curiosity changed the world. It gave us agriculture. It gave us medicine. It gave us spices. It gave us textiles. It gave us dyes. It gave us poisons. And sometimes, it gave us altered states of consciousness. Cannabis belongs to all of those histories at once. And as we move deeper into the centuries, the quiet ancient relationship between humans and this plant will become increasingly complicated. Because eventually, cannabis will leave the ancient world behind. It will enter empires. It will enter medical books. It will enter religious traditions. It will enter trade networks. It will enter colonial societies. And much later, it will become part of one of the most controversial global debates about drugs in modern history. But that future was still thousands of years away. For the earliest cannabis users, there was no modern debate. There was only a plant, a fire, a little smoke, and the mysterious discovery that the human mind could be changed by something growing from the earth. And somewhere in that enormous stretch of forgotten time, humanity began smoking cannabis. We may never know exactly when, but we can still follow the smoke. And so, after thousands of years of scattered evidence, one question remains. When did people actually begin smoking cannabis? The honest answer is that we cannot name the first person, the first day, or even the first civilization with absolute certainty. But by the first millennium BCE, the evidence becomes remarkably difficult to ignore. People in parts of Central Asia were deliberately heating cannabis. They were using vessels and enclosed spaces that could concentrate smoke. They were inhaling it. and ancient writers were already describing the practice as something familiar enough to recognize. By then, cannabis smoking was not an experiment at the edge of human knowledge. It was already part of a tradition. That means the real beginning must have happened earlier. How much earlier remains uncertain, perhaps centuries. Perhaps many centuries. Maybe even more than 2,000 years earlier. The archaeological record simply does not allow us to follow every step, and perhaps that is fitting. Because the earliest cannabis smoker was almost certainly not thinking about making history. They were simply using a plant. That person lived in a world without laboratories, modern medicine, standardized measurements, or scientific explanations for altered consciousness. They had only experience. They knew that some plants healed, some plants nourished, some plants killed, some plants produced dreams, some plants changed the way the world felt. Cannabis belonged somewhere among them. Over generations, this knowledge became more sophisticated. People learned which plants were stronger. They learned how to prepare them. They learned how to preserve them. They learned how much to use, and they learned when not to use them. Not every ancient cannabis user was necessarily seeking intoxication. This is one of the most important points to remember. Cannabis was never simply weed. It was hemp. It was seed. It was oil. It was fiber. It was medicine. It was incense. It was food. It was ritual. It was a psychoactive substance. The meaning depended on the person and the culture. And that complexity continued for thousands of years. In ancient China, cannabis became an important agricultural crop. In Central Asia, it became associated with nomadic traditions and ritual smoke. In India, cannabis became part of medical, religious, and cultural practices. Across the Middle East and later parts of Africa, different preparations appeared. In Europe, hemp became economically important for fiber. Different societies knew different versions of the same plant. And sometimes, those societies had no idea that people thousands of kilometers away were using cannabis in completely different ways. That is what makes the history so fascinating. There was no single cannabis culture. There were many. Each developed under different environmental, technological, religious, and social conditions. And yet, beneath all those differences, there was a shared human curiosity. What happens if we change the way the mind experiences the world? Humans have been asking that question for an extraordinarily long time. Sometimes the answer came through fasting, sometimes through music, sometimes through meditation, sometimes through sleep deprivation, sometimes through ritual, and sometimes through plants. Cannabis was one of the plants that became part of this ancient search. But the story does not end with ancient Central Asia. Far from it. As human populations moved, cannabis traveled with them. The great trade routes of Eurasia became pathways for plants, seeds, and cultural knowledge. The Silk Road was not merely a road for silk. It was a network of human movement. Merchants carried spices, metals, textiles, animals, medicines, ideas, religions, stories, and plants. Cannabis could move through these networks because it was already valuable in several different ways. A merchant might carry seeds because hemp was useful. A physician might carry cannabis because it had medicinal applications. A traveler might carry a preparation because it was part of a familiar tradition. And once the plant reached a new region, local people could adapt it. This process happened again and again. A plant enters a new culture. People experiment with it. They discover new preparations. They give it new meanings. And after enough time passes, those practices can become so deeply rooted that people forget how foreign the plant once was. Cannabis experienced this transformation repeatedly. In South Asia, one of the most famous traditional preparations became bhang. Bhang is not simply smoked cannabis. It is traditionally prepared as a drink or edible preparation, often combined with other ingredients. Its history demonstrates something important. Cannabis culture was never limited to smoking. In many places, eating or drinking cannabis was just as significant, or more significant, than inhalation. Modern cannabis culture often focuses heavily on smoking because modern smoking methods became so widespread. But historically, humans were much more creative. They made drinks. They made pastes. They mixed plants. They prepared oils. They burned flowers. They used resin. They used leaves. They used seeds. The plant could be transformed into many different products, and each method changed the experience. This also explains why ancient descriptions can sometimes seem contradictory. One writer may describe cannabis as medicine. Another may describe it as intoxicating. Another may barely mention its psychoactive effects. They may all be telling the truth. They were simply describing different uses. The same plant can be medicine at one moment and intoxicant at another. The distinction is not always in the plant. It is in how humans use it. This is especially clear in ancient medical traditions. Healers did not divide the world into modern categories of prescription drugs, recreational drugs, supplements, and food. Their understanding of medicine was built around observations. If a plant seemed to relieve a particular problem, it might be included in treatment. If another preparation caused unpleasant effects, it might be avoided. Some treatments were effective. Some were ineffective. Some were dangerous. And some were based on beliefs that modern science no longer accepts. Cannabis existed within this broader world of traditional medicine. Over time, written medical traditions recorded its properties. The ancient and medieval medical world was therefore not unaware of cannabis. It was familiar with it. But familiarity did not mean universal acceptance. Different cultures judged psychoactive substances differently. Some considered them sacred. Some considered them useful. Some considered them suspicious. Some associated them with foreigners. And some regulated them. This pattern is not unique to cannabis. Human societies have always created rules around substances that affect behavior. The rules depend on culture. A plant celebrated in one society can be condemned in another. A substance used in a religious ceremony can be treated as a dangerous intoxicant somewhere else. These differences tell us as much about societies as they do about the substances themselves. And eventually, cannabis would enter a completely different historical world. The age of European expansion. The age of global empires. The age of colonial trade. This period transformed cannabis history. European travelers began encountering cannabis preparations in regions where they had not been culturally prominent in Europe. Physicians became curious. Travelers wrote descriptions. Colonial administrators documented local practices. Scientists began collecting plants. And gradually, cannabis entered Western medical literature in a more systematic way. But by this point, humans had already been using cannabis for thousands of years. The modern world was not discovering cannabis. It was rediscovering and reorganizing ancient knowledge. During the 19th century, European and American physicians became increasingly interested in cannabis preparations. Cannabis extracts and tinctures appeared in medical contexts. Doctors experimented with them for various conditions. Pharmacists sold cannabis preparations. For a time, cannabis could be found in respectable medical settings. This may seem surprising today, but it reflects how dramatically attitudes toward drugs can change over time. A substance can move from medicine to prohibition. Another can move from dangerous poison to prescription treatment. Another can move in the opposite direction. History rarely moves in a straight line, and cannabis is a perfect example. Its story began as a plant. Then it became medicine, then ritual substance, then agricultural commodity, then intoxicant, then controversial drug, then, in some places, legal medicine or recreational product. And the cycle continues. But before modern prohibition, there was another important development. Scientists began asking what exactly cannabis contained. What chemical substances produced its effects? What made one preparation stronger than another? What was happening inside the body? These questions eventually led to modern cannabinoid science. Researchers isolated and studied compounds found in cannabis. The chemistry of the plant gradually became clearer. Much later, scientists identified THC as the principal psychoactive compound responsible for the characteristic intoxicating effects of cannabis. They also discovered the broader cannabinoid system in the human body. This was an extraordinary development. For thousands of years, people had experienced cannabis without knowing why it worked. Modern science eventually began explaining the mechanism, but the discovery did not erase the ancient history. If anything, it made that history more fascinating. Ancient people had discovered something about the human body without knowing the molecular explanation. They had discovered through experience what modern chemistry would later explain through experiments. That is a recurring pattern in human history. People often discover practical truths long before they understand the science behind them. Ancient farmers knew certain seeds grew better in certain soils. They did not understand genetics. Ancient healers knew some plants affected pain. They did not understand receptors. Ancient cooks knew fermentation could transform food. They did not understand microorganisms. And ancient cannabis users knew that heating certain plant material could alter consciousness. They did not understand cannabinoids. Knowledge often begins with observation. Science comes later. The ancient cannabis story is therefore not simply a story about drugs. It is a story about how humans learn. We observe, we experiment, we remember, we teach, we repeat, we modify. And eventually, sometimes thousands of years later, someone explains why the old practice worked. That is why the question, When did people start smoking weed is more complicated than it first appears. If we mean the first human interaction with cannabis, the answer goes back many thousands of years. If we mean deliberate cultivation, the answer is also extremely ancient. If we mean medicinal use, again, the history is ancient. If we mean deliberate psychoactive use, the evidence becomes more difficult, but still reaches deep into antiquity. If we mean smoking specifically, strong evidence points to ancient Central Asia by at least the first millennium BCE, with the possibility of earlier use. And if we mean the modern form of cannabis smoking familiar today, that is much more recent. The joint, the modern pipe, the standardized commercial product, the dispensary, the high-potency strains, and the legal cannabis industry are all products of much later history. Ancient people were not smoking modern marijuana. They were using the cannabis varieties available in their environment. Those plants could differ substantially in chemistry. Some were primarily fiber plants. Some contained more resin. Some were better suited to local climates. And selective cultivation probably influenced these characteristics over time. This is another reason why the phrase weed can be misleading when applied to ancient history. Modern cannabis varieties have been shaped by centuries of cultivation, selection, breeding, and eventually scientific research. Ancient cannabis was not necessarily the same, chemically or genetically, as what exists today. The experience could therefore have been different. Even the way people consumed it was different. A modern smoker might inhale a carefully prepared product in a few seconds. An ancient ritual might involve heating stones, enclosing smoke in a small space, and inhaling collectively. The setting changed. The technology changed. The cultural meaning changed. The plant itself changed. But the basic human curiosity remained. What does this plant do? That question may be one of the oldest parts of the entire story. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that cannabis was not alone. Human societies around the world discovered psychoactive plants independently. People experimented with mushrooms, cacti, vines, seeds, leaves, resins, fermented drinks, roots, fungi, and countless other substances. The human relationship with altered consciousness is extraordinarily old. Cannabis simply became one of the most globally influential examples. Its journey from Central Asian landscapes to modern cities took thousands of years. Along the way, it crossed nearly every major boundary humans created. It crossed borders, languages, religions, empires, economic systems, medical traditions, and eventually political systems. Few plants have had such a complicated history. And perhaps that is why the simple question of when people began smoking it leads us so far back into human history. It forces us to think about migration, agriculture, trade, religion, medicine, technology, archaeology, chemistry, and human curiosity. The first cannabis smokers were not part of a modern counterculture. They were ancient people. They lived in societies whose values and assumptions were very different from ours. They probably had no concept of marijuana as a global commodity. They had no concept of cannabis prohibition. They had no idea that thousands of years later, governments would debate whether the plant should be legal. They were simply living their lives. They cultivated crops. They raised animals. They traveled. They buried their dead. They prepared food. They made clothing. They built fires. And sometimes they burned cannabis. The smoke rose, people inhaled, and something happened inside their minds. That simple act would eventually become part of a history stretching across continents and millennia. The smoke that began in ancient contexts would eventually appear in medieval medical traditions, then in early modern trade networks, then in colonial medicine, then in 19th century pharmacies, then in 20th century prohibition debates, and eventually in 21st century legal markets. But the earliest chapter is quieter. There is no dramatic beginning, no single inventor, no famous discovery, just people and plants. That may be the most accurate way to imagine the beginning, a plant growing in the Eurasian landscape, humans noticing it, humans finding uses for it, and gradually learning that it could do something unusual. The first discovery may have happened accidentally. A piece of cannabis may have fallen into a fire. Smoke filled the air. Someone inhaled it. Perhaps nothing happened. Perhaps the plant was weak. Perhaps the conditions were wrong. Perhaps another person tried again. Eventually, someone discovered the right combination of heat, plant material, and inhalation. And then the knowledge could spread. We cannot prove that this is how it happened, but it illustrates how many human discoveries may have begun. Accident followed by curiosity. Curiosity followed by experimentation. Experimentation followed by tradition. Tradition followed by culture. Culture followed by history. And that is how a wild plant can become a global cultural phenomenon. The ancient history of cannabis therefore ends where the modern story begins. By the time the modern world encountered cannabis, the plant already carried thousands of years of human experience. Its fibers had clothed people. Its seeds had fed people. Its oils had served practical purposes. Its medicinal preparations had entered traditional healing. Its smoke had entered rituals. Its psychoactive effects had been known. Its cultivation had spread. Its cultural meanings had multiplied. Everything modern societies would later argue about was built upon this enormous ancient foundation. So perhaps the better question is not simply, when did people start smoking weed? Perhaps the deeper question is, why did humans keep returning to this plant? The answer is partly because cannabis is unusually versatile. It can be useful without being intoxicating. It can be medicinal without being recreational. It can be agricultural without being religious. It can be cultural without being political. And it can be psychoactive without having only one meaning. That versatility allowed cannabis to survive enormous changes in human society. Empires rose, empires fell. Languages disappeared, religions transformed, trade routes shifted, technologies changed, yet cannabis remained. It adapted. Humans adapted it. And each generation inherited something from the previous one. That is why the cannabis story is ultimately much bigger than smoking. Smoking is only one chapter. The full history is a story of a plant and humanity growing alongside each other. The earliest farmers could not have imagined modern laboratories. The ancient nomads could not have imagined modern legalization debates. Medieval healers could not have imagined cannabinoid receptors. 19th century physicians could not have imagined modern genetic research. And modern cannabis consumers live in a world radically different from all of them. Yet there is one continuous thread: the plant. From ancient Central Asian landscapes to modern cities, cannabis has remained part of human history. And somewhere along that long journey, thousands of years ago, people discovered how to turn its leaves or flowers into smoke, and bring that smoke into the human body. That was the beginning of cannabis smoking. Not a single date, not a single inventor, not a single civilization, but a gradual discovery that probably happened long before anyone thought to record it. The archaeological evidence eventually gives us glimpses. The ancient writers give us descriptions. Chemistry gives us confirmation. And together, these fragments allow us to see something that would otherwise have vanished completely. We can see ancient people experimenting with cannabis. We can see evidence of burning. We can see evidence of inhalation. We can see ritual vessels. We can see residues. We can see the movement of the plant across continents. And we can understand that the history of cannabis is far older than the modern word weed. Much older. Thousands of years older. The next time you hear someone describe cannabis as a modern invention, remember how misleading that idea is. The modern cannabis industry is new. Modern strains are new. Modern legalization is new. Modern prohibition is relatively new. But human interaction with cannabis is ancient. Its story reaches into the prehistoric past, and its earliest smokers are lost to time. They left no photographs, no names, no recordings, only traces. A burned vessel, a residue, a plant fragment, a written description centuries later, and the faint chemical signature of a relationship that began long before modern civilization. Perhaps that is the most peaceful way to end this journey. Not with a dramatic discovery, but with the realization that human history is full of forgotten beginnings. Someone, somewhere, once tried something for the first time. Most of those moments disappeared. But occasionally, fragments survive. Cannabis is one of those fragments. We do not know the first person who smoked it. We do not know what they called the plant. We do not know what they believed the smoke meant. We do not know whether they were curious, ceremonial, medicinal, or simply experimenting. But we know that the relationship became real. And once it began, it never truly disappeared. It traveled through generations, through landscapes, through cultures, through empires, through centuries, and eventually it arrived in our own time. So the story of cannabis smoking does not really have an ending. The ancient chapter simply fades into the modern one. The fire goes quiet. The smoke disappears. The people who first experienced it are gone. But the knowledge survived. And perhaps that is the strangest thing of all. Thousands of years ago, someone discovered that a particular plant could change the human experience. Today, we understand far more about why. But the basic discovery remains ancient. A plant, heat, smoke, and a human mind wondering what had just happened. That was enough to begin one of the longest and most complicated relationships between a plant and humanity ever recorded. And now, after thousands of years, we can finally see just how old that relationship really is.